Hi, my name's Penny, and as usual, I'm here to talk about some bookish things. Specifically, today I wanted to talk to you all about all the books I read in October. Now, I read 23 books in October, which is pretty good, although as far as my goal goes to get my physical TBR shelves down, I only read 2 books off my physical TBR shelf, and I actually got 3 books out of a little library and 1 book for $2 from a thrift shop. So I didn't spend too much money on books, but I did put it up by 4. So overall, I'm still up 72 books on the shelf. It's more than I was hoping to have on there at the end of the year, but never mind. Quality-wise, I did do quite well in October. I read a lot less 2 stars than I had in the previous month. Still a few, because I always expect to get some 2 stars because I read books that I know are a bit of a risk, ones that I'm not sure whether I'll like them or not. But sometimes those books surprise me, so I think it's worth it. So let's get into the books. I will be talking about things from worst to best, but first I do want to mention 2 non-fiction books that I read that I don't really like to put in the ranking system, because how do you really compare non-fiction books to fiction books? It makes no sense because they're just quite different things. Anyway, firstly, I read The How of Happiness by Sonja Lyubomirsky. I don't think that's how you say her surname. I really should look up how to say it. This is a book with a bunch of different scientific studies about happiness, and it also has 12 different kind of areas of happiness strategies that you can match yourself to which areas suit you, and then pick out the strategies that might help you to be happier to some degree. I thought it had a lot of really interesting information as well as some really useful ideas, so I really enjoyed that. I also read Quiet by Susan Cain, which is a book all about introversion and what it's like to be an introvert in American society. I think it had a lot of interesting information about kind of the history of American culture in regards to how extroverted kind of the American standard is. So it definitely helped me to understand introversion better, but it spent a lot of the book reassuring its reader that it's okay to be an introvert, and that wasn't really what I was looking for in the book. So I think it's still a really valuable book. If you want to understand more about introversion, I would definitely recommend it, but it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. I have read a whole bunch of introvert books recently-ish, not really that recently, but recently-ish. I read a bunch of introvert books, and I have promised a video where I will talk about all of those, and I still promise it is coming. So that's something you're interested in, just have patience with me. I'm behind on everything at the moment. Alright, then fiction books, starting from the worst one, which was Fairest, Levana's story by Marissa Meyer. This is a prequel to the Lunar Chronicles, which is a science fiction story where each book in the series is a retelling of a different fairy tale, and Levana is the villain of the story, essentially the Wicked Witch from Cinderella, or also the Wicked Witch from Snow White in a different context. Anyway, the Wicked Witch. And the story kind of attempts to justify her behavior in those stories. I don't think it did a very good job of doing that. And in general, it just wasn't a very interesting story. I think if you really love the Lunar Chronicles, you still might want to read it for completeness. But if you don't read it, you're not missing out. I also read Hotel Oblivion by Gerard and Gabriel. So this is the 3rd volume of the Umbrella Academy graphic novel series. Gerard being the singer from My Chemical Romance, who have just announced a comeback, so I'm excited for that. Unfortunately, Hotel Oblivion, I just think it has some really amazing ideas. I love the color scheme of the art, even if the art isn't always very clear what's happening. But I also just think that the storytelling is always so fragmented and hard to follow that even though there's great concepts, it's not well executed. I do think that if Netflix takes these concepts and puts them into the Netflix show, it will be done really well, so I'm hopeful for that. I don't have this here because I actually bought it for my sister for her birthday, and I don't think she's read it yet, but I know she's also really excited for MCR's comeback, so I'm sure she will be reading it soon. I also listened to the audiobook of The Near Witch by Victoria Schwab. So this is Victoria Schwab's debut novel, but after it first came out, it went out of print. It didn't really do that well for her, but now that she is very successful, they decided to re-release it. Unfortunately, not surprisingly, it doesn't really live up to some of her later writing. So even though it was an okay read or an okay listen, overall I didn't find the concepts to be anything particularly unique. I found the relationship in it very doubtful and just wasn't that exciting. So basically it follows this girl who lives in this very small isolated town. This stranger arrives in town, and at about the same time the children from the village start going missing. There's a lot of suspicion being thrown around on the stranger, on these witches that live just out of town, and this main girl is getting involved in trying to save the children. Then I listened to the audiobook of Oversea Under Stone by Susan Cooper. So this is the first book in this middle grade series that is all about these children who go on holiday in the country with their eccentric uncle, and they get involved in this Arthurian-inspired battle between good and evil. I think that people who really like the Chronicles of Narnia and A Wrinkle in Time would probably also quite like this story. For me, I just didn't quite vibe with it, but I have heard that the series improves as it goes on, so at some point I will be continuing the series in the hope that I will enjoy it more. I do suspect that it's one of these ones where if you read it as a child, you are very attached to it, but if you come to it later on, maybe it doesn't have quite as much impact. But again, I'll try the rest of the series and we'll see how that goes. Then I listened to the audiobook of Kabu Kabu by Nnedi Okorafor. Did I take this off my list? Actually, this is another book that came off my physical TBR shelf. So I did read 3 books off my physical TBR shelf. That's still not as good as I would have liked it to be, but still. So I listened to the audiobook of this. It's a bunch of short stories all based around African culture. There were a few stories that I really liked, primarily around these zombie robots that fix the oil pipelines, and also a few around women who gained their wings or the ability to fly. I feel like already I've forgotten quite a lot of the stories in here. I know I did struggle with differentiating when the audiobook would swap from one story to another because the endings were quite often quite anticlimactic, and so I didn't even realize that it was the ending. But I do think that short story anthologies are just something that I really struggle with. I think if you have an interest in African mythology and African culture, that you probably would like this. If you really like Nnedi Okorafor, you probably will like this. It just probably wasn't for me. Alright, so now we're up to the bit of my list where things start to get a bit confusing, and that is because there are several series in this list where I read several books in the series, but their ratings don't really go together. So the next one in my list is actually Paper Girls. Which one is the right one? Paper Girls 6. So this is the last book in the Paper Girls series, and when I went through and rated it all again, I was too lazy to give these ones separate ratings, so I just rated the whole series up to here, because on reread they all kind of merged together anyway because I already knew it all. I did like these ones a lot more on the reread, so they are further up in the pile. Number 6, I did find the ending a bit disappointing. I don't like the final state of the relationship between the girls, even though I guess there's some hope in it. I just feel like I got to the end, and instead of being like, oh, that's cool, which is how I want to feel when I get to the end of a time travel story, because this is the story about a bunch of paper girls in the 80s who end up time traveling around time and getting in the middle of this battle between the, what are they called, the old timers and the teenagers. Old timers believe that time shouldn't be changed, and the younger generation believes that they should be able to go back in time and make things better for generations in the past, and they're at war over this philosophical difference. I think it made a lot more sense on reread, but the last volume, I just felt like everything didn't come together as well as I would have hoped. Still, I do think the art is really beautiful, the colors are amazing, so if you are interested in time travel and you like graphic novels that are a little bit strange, then you still might like the series. I still think it's worth a read. And also I read the last 4 volumes of Death Note, so volumes 9, 10, 11, and 12, and the ratings for these just get better and better and better. So number 9 I didn't necessarily like that much. it felt a little bit directionless, and then as we go along things get rated higher and higher. So number 9 is here, and I'll talk about how exciting number 12 was when I get to where that is in the rating scale. Then I also read Peeps by Scott Westerfeld. So this is a vampire book, and the concept of the vampires here is that they are people with this parasite that makes them have not extraordinary human strength, but just like the peak of human strength and speed and all that. And then every second chapter in this book tells you a little bit about parasites in the real world, because the way that parasites work in the real world kind of links into what happens with these vampires in the story. So we're following this particular vampire as he tries to track down his progenitor, so the vampire that made him. But I think the most interesting thing about the story is the way that it talks about anathema. How do you say that word? Anyway, when someone becomes a vampire, the parasite in them does some level of mind control to make it so that they now hate anything that they used to love. And the argument is that's why vampires in medieval times couldn't deal with the crucifix, because a lot of them were of some kind of Christian or Catholic faith. And so before they were vampires, they loved the cross. Now that they're vampires, that's something that they hate. When he's tracking down different vampires, he'll be trying to find out what it was they loved when they were alive so that he can bring that along to the battle and use it to repel them during the fight, or use it, at one point he puts up this poster of Elvis in the doorway so that the vampire won't be able to escape through the doorway. I thought that was a really cool idea. I do think the plot got a little bit lost in parts, but the general concept was cool. So if you like vampires and you want kind of a unique spin on it, then this book was okay. I also have The Dark Bolt by Victoria Schwab. This was actually a very Schwab kind of month. So this is actually a bind up of 2 stories, The Archived and The Unbound. And in this world, when you die, a memory of you is stored in the archives, which is kind of this library of the undead in another dimension. And in between our world and the library is the Narrows, which is basically just like these alleyways that don't go anywhere. And sometimes the memories of these dead people escape, get stuck in the Narrows, and we follow this girl named Mackenzie, whose job is to go into the Narrows and force those people back into the archives. I thought the concept for this was amazing, but I'm not going to talk about how much I love the archive, because actually at this point we're talking about the Unbound. The Unbound I found a little bit disappointing, especially after loving the archive so much. I just think the plot wasn't as solid. It didn't make as much sense. Our main character Mackenzie did a lot of things that just seemed strange, like why not just talk to the people who are supposedly on your side? So I did still enjoy the Unbound, but it wasn't as good as the archived. Okay, then we have Death Note 10. All I'm going to say is better than 9, not as good as 11. Because to be honest, even at this point, I don't even remember what happened in each book, because I read them all. So then we actually get up to 1 to 5 of Paper Girls. As I said, I do think this art is really cool. I think it's a really fun story, and I like the different relationships between the different girls, as well as their older selves that they sometimes run into. I know some people really love this series, so I do think that if you like graphic novels and you like time travel and you like the 80s, and perhaps actually if you like Saga, because it is by the same people, I do think that this is a fun series and it's worth picking up if it seems like it might be up your alley. Okay, so now we're up to Death Note 11, and I think from here on up my list gets into ones that I really enjoyed. This one was just setting things up so well for the finale. I've talked about Death Note a bit, but if you don't know what it's about, basically we've got this guy named Light Yugumi, and he found this notebook that belonged to a death demon or a death god, one of the Shinigami, and when you write a name in that notebook, it kills that person, and Light decides to use this in order to kill off all the criminals. He thinks he's making the world better. Obviously, some people don't agree with that strategy, and he's kind of in this psychological battle with different people throughout the story. As we line up to the last one, kind of lining up to this big final battle of wits, and it was just a good time. I can see that Death Note might not be for everyone, But if you like the first few volumes, I do think you'll like the last few. So even though there are a few points in the series where it's not as good as some of the other parts, I do think the payoff and the ending makes it all worth it. Anyway, this is number 11, not even the last book. So I also read Neverworld Wake by Marisha Pessl. So this is another one that is a weird, twisty time story. So we follow this girl, what was her name? B. She has a bunch of rich friends that she met in this private boarding school that she went to. But then there was an accident. Her boyfriend ended up dying in mysterious circumstances, and she hasn't talked to these friends since. Then she gets invited to this birthday party. She goes. They have a car accident and get stuck in this weird time loop where at the end of the loop, they need to vote and decide who is going to get to live once the loop finishes. I do think the ending of this ruined it for me a little bit, but I really liked it when they were in the time loop and experimenting with how it worked and trying to figure out what happened to her boyfriend when he died, trying to figure out that mystery. I really enjoyed. I think if you like the movie Edge of Tomorrow, you might like this. It's the same kind of time loop idea, although it's a little bit more supernatural. I do think if you like weird time loop stories, you should definitely be reading this book. I mean, if you don't like weird time loop stuff, then I'm sorry about your life. So the next book on my list is one I got out of the library, and that is Tunnel of Bones by Victoria Schwab. This is the second book in the Cassidy Blake series, which is all about this girl named Cassidy Blake who is able to see ghosts. And in fact, her best friend is a ghost, but also her parents are making this documentary about ghosts, and they're taking her to different haunted cities, not aware that their daughter is able to see ghosts. So in each different city that they go to, she ends up fighting a scary ghost and trying to send it on. So the first book was set in Edinburgh, and this one is set in Paris. I did really enjoy it. I'm actually questioning my rating system because I don't know that Tunnel of Bones was actually better than Neverworld Wake, but there is only 0.1 of a difference in my rating scale, so I guess there's some kind of margin of error in there. But if you want a spooky middle grade book, then I would definitely recommend Tunnel of Bones and the Cassidy Blake series in general. There is going to be another book. I believe the next one is going to be set in New Orleans, so I'm excited for that whenever it comes out. Victoria Schwab works way too hard, so I'm sure we won't have to wait very long. Then I also listened to Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shauna Maguire. This is the second book in the Wayward Children series, and it's a reread for me. I've read this series before, but I decided I wanted to reread the series before the fifth book comes out in January. And I'm really glad I did because there's a lot that I have forgotten. But going into this, I did know that Down Among the Sticks and Bones is my favorite of the series. And after a reread, I still think that's totally true. The series follows a group of children, all of which at some point have gone through a magical door and found this magical world that they really loved, a la Narnia or Wonderland or all those kind of worlds. But then unfortunately, circumstances have meant that they ended up back in the ordinary world, and they all go to this halfway house where they're able to adapt back to normal life and just give each other some understanding and support about how disappointed they are to be back here. Every second book in this series tends to follow someone on their journey to the magical world. So in Down Among the Sticks and Bones, we're following Jack and Jill as they go to the moors. This book has a lot to say about giving children the freedom to be who they are and kind of the harm that you can cause by forcing children into certain expectations. And I guess the harm of people who don't like children, having children just to keep up expectations. I love the very whimsical vibe of the storytelling in this story, and I do also really recommend the audiobook. It's actually narrated by Shauna Maguire herself, and she did a really good job. Then just briefly, this is the point on the list where we get up to Death Note 12. I'm not sure you can really even see that because it's so bright today, but Death Note 12 just like really drew out that anticipation for the ending. It was so suspenseful. I was shouting at this book because of what it was doing, and then the drama at the end was just the perfect ending to the whole thing. I wasn't sure that this was going to manage to pull off a satisfying ending, but in the end it was really satisfying, and I'm really glad that I pushed through the whole series. It was a bit of a roller coaster, but I really enjoyed it. Then I also read Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. This is a very hyped story all about a girl named Meyer who goes to assassin school in the hopes of gaining the skills to take revenge on the people who have destroyed her family. It's quite a dark fantasy, although it wasn't as dark as I expected, but I think that's just because my tolerance level of dark things is quite high. I like things to be pretty dark. But it did definitely have a lot of really great concepts, especially like Mr. Kindly, which is the shadow cat that hangs around with Meyer, and Meyer herself has some level of shadow magic, which I also really enjoyed. Okay, so now we're down to the top 3, and this next book is the most surprising book of the month for me, and that was Where They Found Her by Kimberly McCreight. So I picked this up for the Spookathon prompt to read a thriller, and I struggle to find thrillers that I really enjoy. I find domestic thrillers normally just all the characters are so dysfunctional and they just annoy me. Like, I don't mind dysfunctional characters because I'm dysfunctional. Everyone's dysfunctional to some level. But in domestic thrillers, it's just usually so over the top. And I guess a lot of people like that. But generally, I don't. Anyway, regardless, Where They Found Her is all about this body that gets found in the forest, and we're following this woman who's sort of changed careers to become a journalist, and she gets put on the story even though she's possibly not qualified to do it. There's kind of a multi-generational thing going on, so there are some children and some teenagers in there as well. I didn't think the synopsis sounded particularly amazing, but the way that everything wove together was really amazing, and it was just like reveal after reveal, and even when you found out who the dead body was, there were still so many questions to be answered. I just thought, I was listening to the audiobook and walking home listening to it, I was just like, what? And then I got home, I still had 20 minutes to go, and I just couldn't stop listening to it because I had to find out how it ended. So I think if you're not someone who normally likes domestic thrillers and you want to like them, because I want to like them, like when I find ones that I love them, but it's so hard to find. Anyway, Where They Found Her, I really enjoyed it. I love the twists and turns. I thought the characters seemed fairly relatable and realistic, and it was just a good time. Again, a bit dark, but definitely entertaining. Okay, and finally we get back to the Dark Vault. So the first half of this, the archived, I absolutely loved it. The concepts were so amazing. The way that the world was revealed and the world building was done, I just thought was so good. I loved the characters and the relationships. I thought it dealt really well with grief and losing a loved one, because our main character has lost both her brother and her grandfather, and there are parts in the archive that are just so emotional. I love the way the story all came together in the ending, and I know that there is going to be a TV series made of this series, or at least inspired by this series, and as I was reading it, I was so excited because I think the concepts are going to be amazing as a TV show. So I 100% recommend reading this series before the TV show comes out, because I think it's going to be amazing. They are talking about it being very supernatural-like, and I love supernatural. I think we definitely need a new Supernatural because it probably went on a little bit long, but never mind. But a new story in the same kind of vein could be really cool. This definitely has a lot of potential for some really cool stories, so I am excited to see how that goes. Then lastly, my favorite book of the whole month is Descender Volume 6. So this is a 6-volume science fiction series all about this war between robots and humans. Basically, humans have spread out all across the universe, and then these giant robots turn up at the beginning of the series and just obliterate a significant portion of humanity. The humans then retaliate by just killing off lots of the robots, even though they depend on robots to do so much for them. And through most of the story, we follow this tiny robot. You can barely see him on this cover, but he's significant on some of the other covers. He is a companion robot, and he gets kind of involved in this investigation trying to find out why these giant robots turned up in the beginning and attacked the humans. The robots in this almost all of them. I absolutely loved them. It did such a good job of humanizing the robots, and the human characters, you know, I liked them too. Not as much as the robots, but they were still good. I think the way that this wrapped up the series was so amazing. It just wrapped things up really well, and it made me really emotional, and I'm really excited because there is going to be another spin-off series continuing on from this, kind of set sometime in the future, called Ascender. I think actually the first volume has been released. I missed the release date somehow, but I do have a hold at the library for it, so I'm excited that that's going to turn up at some point, and I'm going to be able to read that. I will probably read it as soon as it turns up, because this series, I love this series. I definitely want to reread it at some point, and I know that I'm going to love Ascender. I know it in my heart. If you like sci-fi, you should read this graphic novel series. Read it, or, you know, do whatever you want with your life, because I'm not the boss of you. And seriously, if someone tells me to do something, I don't do it. So maybe I should use reverse psychology on you. Anyway, this video is probably really long because I talked about a lot of books, and I do try to keep my wrap-ups short. I keep thinking about doing mid-month wrap-ups, but I just like looking at the month as a whole. So you're going to be stuck with longer wrap-ups. Although, I'm trying to read less books and focus more on the rest of my life, so maybe we can get these wrap-ups down to a reasonable length. Who knows? I don't know how to predict the future, unfortunately. Sorry about that. Anyway, if you have read any of the books that I talked about today, I would love to hear your thoughts about them and talk to you about them down in the comments. Or if you're thinking about reading any of these books, I'd love to know that too. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.